Hey kids, I'm Sean Vincent Biggins, and welcome to part 2 of the 6th episode of Old T-Shirt Tuesday. So you may remember at the end of part 1 that I mentioned receiving that $300 travel voucher. Well, I felt that trip to the Northwest was not long enough. There was a lot more to see, and I also caught the photography bug while I was there. So at some point over the next few months, I went out and bought my own 35mm SLR camera, actually a Minolta Maxim 3XI, and I decided that I would go back and take a longer trip to the Northwest using that travel voucher. And this time I wouldn't have to borrow my mother's camera. In addition to being a photographer, as many of you know, I'm also an actor. I started in children's theater when I was 10 years old. I went to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York City when I was 20. And one of my classmates at the Academy in New York was from Portland, Oregon. Now, my previous trip to the Northwest hadn't been long enough for me to really make it down to Portland at all. But this trip was going to be longer. Well, my friend, along with her boyfriend at the time, were gracious enough to let me stay with them while I was there. And I was able to use their place as a home base of sorts. And they had a Dalmatian, which was pretty fun too. My friend took me to see all these beautiful waterfalls that are on the Oregon side of the Columbia River, including the amazing Multnomah Falls. I got to see people windsurfing on the river, which was another first for me. And we watched the sunset from a spot high above the Columbia River called Vista House. One night, the two of them took me out to this new thing called a brew pub, which is what we would call a microbrewery today. And this was really early in the microbrewery movement. I think this was the first one they had in Portland. I don't remember the name of it, unfortunately. I got to see the breathtaking Oregon coast and the astonishing Crater Lake, which is in the center of Oregon and still one of the most beautiful places I have ever seen. I also experienced perhaps the worst smell I've ever experienced when I drove past what was apparently a craft pulp paper mill. To this day, whenever I smell something horrid, I compare it to the smell of a paper mill. I visited the lovely Rose Garden and the Japanese Garden, both in Portland. I even swung back up into Washington State a couple of times as well. I went to Mount St. Helens, which had erupted 13 years earlier in 1980, and you could still see the devastation, with thousands of dead trees, some still standing, some laying on the ground, some floating in a nearby lake. But small green vegetation was growing all over the place, so life was definitely returning. I went to the incredible Snoqualmie Falls, which is where they shot the TV show Twin Peaks back in the 90s. And I visited the town of Roslyn, aka Sicily, Alaska, once again. This time, they were actually shooting while I was there. You can see the star of the show, Rob Morrow, there. There's Elaine Miles, who played Marilyn. That might be Janine Turner right there. Oh boy, did I have a thing for her back then. Now this is Darren E. Burrows, aka Ed Chigliak, on the roof of the local bar, The Brick. Funny story about this photo. I was standing across the street with a bunch of other people, other tourists who were there, watching them film this scene. And I didn't realize that my camera was on the last shot on the roll. So as soon as I took this shot, my camera started rewinding itself very loudly. I tried to tuck it under my coat to muffle the sound, but you can still hear it pretty well. And then, of course, after the director yelled cut, we were then asked to please not shoot any photos while they were rolling. Oops. This scene ended up being part of the season 5 premiere episode called Three Doctors, which aired on September 20th, 1993. Then, on a little bit of a whim, I stopped in at a winery, which I hadn't done before, ever. a winery called the Staten Hills Winery in Washington State, which began my first love affair with wine. Muscat Canelli was the wine that did it for me. I do love me some dessert wine. When I got home to Massachusetts, I called them on the phone and had them ship an entire case of it to me. And whenever I brought a bottle with me to a party, it was gone in 5 minutes. Sadly, the Staten Hills Winery no longer exists. I made it back to Seattle to shoot some photos of the city from the lovely Queen Anne Hills section. Amazing view from up there. It was an amazing trip once again. I was even able to capture a couple of fun shots from the plane shortly after taking off for home. The Pacific Northwest is so amazingly gorgeous. It's one of the few places I could see myself living. If I were filthy rich, I would have a house here in California, one back home in New England, maybe even on Nantucket, one in Ireland, and one in the Pacific Northwest. I've actually been up in the Pacific Northwest 4 more times since I moved to California, so that's a total of 6 trips. 3 of those, my wife was with me. And I think she would agree with me. At this point, you've seen the 3 t-shirts I was planning to feature in this episode. Now I'm throwing a bonus t-shirt at you. So I guess this episode has become a quadruple double episode. Well, that's just about it for this episode, but it was a very fun one to write because as I was writing it, I was remembering a lot of the little details as I was going through my visual memories of things. Like I said, I've, at this point, been to the Northwest 6 times, but those 2 trips in 92 and 93 will always have a special place in my heart because everything was new to me. Well, guess that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.